Congress is on recess this week, but questions are still swirling over how to handle Russia. FBI Director James Comey briefed members of the Senate Intelligence Committee on Friday. The senators stayed tight-lipped about that meeting, but then a very telling signal from Senator Marco Rubio. He tweeted, "I am now very confident Senate Intel Committee I serve on will conduct thorough bipartisan investigation of Putin, interference, and influence." The briefing from the FBI came the same day as the White House Chief of Staff Reince Priebus complained that the Russia story is overblown.
I have talked to top levels of the intelligence community at every department, by the way, not just people that are only folks that we've put in place, and they have green-lighted me to say that I have talked to the highest levels of intelligence officials, and they have assured me that the New York Times story about constant contacts is grossly overstated and inaccurate.
Manu, in really what was a chaotic week for the Trump administration, this was maybe one of the most important things that happened. In some ways, it didn't get a lot of attention. What are you hearing about what came out of this meeting and what might be next?
Well, really, the only thing we know is that they discussed Russia. This was a Russia meeting as part of the Senate Intelligence Committee's investigation into Russia. Both the members who were there were the members of the full committee, as well as members of the leadership. We know Chuck Schumer was there. We believe Mitch McConnell was there as well, although he went in the back way into the room. It was under the radar. They did not announce it, but they had it in the Capitol. Reporters saw Comey go in there, which is why it led to all this media coverage. The Senate Intelligence Committee is probably the one venue where there is a bipartisan investigation at the moment. We'll see if the bipartisan process eventually breaks down, but both sides believe that they're doing or have faith in this process. On the House side, the Intelligence Committee is becoming more of a partisan process.
Right.
And Devin Nunes, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, is not going as far as some Democrats would like, even on the issue of the discussions between Trump and Mike Flynn before Flynn just talked with the Russian ambassadors. Nunes told me last week that he believes that that's not covered because it was, quote, executive privilege, even though at the time Trump was a president-elect and not the president of the United States.
Convenient.
But this is putting more pressure on the Senate Intelligence Committee to do a more bipartisan look, a deeper dive into into what happened. It'll be interesting to see if they actually saw the transcripts between Flynn and the Russian ambassador, because I had talked to Richard Burr, the chairman of the committee, last week. At that time, he said they had not seen the transcripts, but they requested the transcripts. So we'll see if that was part of that discussion on Friday.
And on Thursday, we saw Donald Trump face questions from reporters about his involvement with Russia and all of the stories coming out about his campaign aides possibly having contacts with Russia during the campaign.
Can you say whether you are aware that anyone who advised your campaign had contacts with Russia during the course of the election?
Well, I told you, General Flynn obviously was dealing, so that's one person, but he was dealing as he should have been.
During the election?
No, nobody that I know of.
So you're not aware of any contacts during the course of the election?
How many times do I have to answer this question?
Can you just say
Russia
yes or no
is
on
a
it?
ruse. Yeah, I know you have to get up and ask a question, so important. Russia is a ruse. I have nothing to do with Russia. Haven't made a phone call to Russia in years. Don't speak to people from Russia. Not that I wouldn't, I just have nobody to speak to.
Julie, this isn't a yes or no question for you, but he's clearly going to get this question about Russia a lot. And how problematic is his answer to that question so far? And the fact that he has to keep answering, how problematic is it?
Well, I think it was interesting the way that he phrased it there, and then a little bit later in that exchange, he said, nobody that I know of was in contact with Russians during the campaign. And then later he said that there were no contacts to his knowledge, which is actually a very lawyerly way of answering that question. I think it's fascinating. If you talk to people in the White House, Priebus said this on television, they feel like there is no information here. They don't know why this keeps coming up. At the same time, it does keep coming up. And I think that it is worthy of exploration, if for nothing else. If you believe that there were no contacts between the Trump campaign and Russian officials during the course of the election, then you should be fully open to an investigation of why Russia was interfering in the election, which seems to be generally accepted that happened. And the fact that there is such resistance then from Republicans and people within Trump's administration to the investigation of the election hacking, to me, is very curious.
Yeah.
No, I think that's right. And one of the things we've seen also this week, Ryan, you talked about the National Security Advisor. There is someone in that position right now, but Robert Harward, this Vice Admiral, said no to the administration, citing some of the chaos. He officially said it was about family and financial reasons, but also pointing to the chaos and not being able to put his own folks into that position and as underlings. What does this say about the Trump White House? Is this going to be a consistent problem in filling this particular post?
Yeah, and two things. One, before I say that, just on Julie's question, that was really a model of how to ask the president a question. Simple, direct, demanding yes or no. Because sometimes when you ask him a question, he dodges. And so, great job asking him the way you did. I think on the National Security Council, look, there's some reporting that he saw that press conference, and it was after he saw that press conference that he made the final decision, like, I'm not going to be the National Security Advisor in this White House. And other reporting suggests that he was not allowed to have the staffers that he wanted, right? So there's a lot of holdovers from the Flynn era. A lot of people who are very loyal to President Trump during the campaign are at the leadership of the National Security Council. Anyone who is going to come into that position has to have their own team. You'd be crazy not to demand that. That's just normal as part of that process. Someone like that who spent decades in the military, when the commander-in-chief asks you to be the national security advisor and you say no, that is stunning. Most military people at that level, they don't say no.
Right.
To the
They see it
commander-in-chief.
as it's a call of duty, and they have a sense of honor almost in accepting it.
Absolutely. So that is a stunning rejection for the president. And one of the reasons where this whole process, whereby Trump makes public the people that he is giving the job to or offering the job to, can have a lot of blowback and is embarrassing. In previous administrations, you hid that process because you didn't want to be embarrassed by a rejection.
Yeah, and in this White House, it's sort of, or I guess it's in the winter White House. It's out in the open there in terms of it's a public thing. And the candidates, or the sort of finalists or the short list, the names we're getting: Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, who's in the position right now; John Bolton, who's the former U.S. ambassador; also Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster and Lieutenant General Robert L. Caslen. Manu, you have heard that Senator Cruz apparently is big on Bolton.
He is. He told me that on Friday. He actually wanted to push Bolton's name and said that he'd be perfect for the job. But as we were discussing during the break, Bolton has a lot of views that are in direct contradiction of Donald Trump's, namely on Iraq. Bolton was one of the main supporters of Iraq, the Iraq War. Trump, during the campaign, insisted he had always opposed the Iraq War. And also, Bolton has this neoconservative, interventionist view of the world that's not what the view that Donald Trump espoused on the campaign trail. So, but there are a lot of conservatives who are pushing Bolton very hard, and perhaps they're winning. He's probably potentially winning over some support within the White House because he's meeting with Trump this weekend in Mar-a-Lago. So we'll see if he goes that route. But if he does, it could upset some of the people in the more libertarian wing of the Republican Party as well, including Rand Paul, who tried to scuttle any discussion of getting Bolton in the State Department job because he sits on the Foreign Relations Committee. Rand Paul does. So that would certainly be a controversial pick.
Yeah, and so, I mean, no matter what, I imagine somebody's going to be upset by this pick. There are all sorts of internal sort of power centers in the White House, and some people think there's too much politicization going on in terms of this national security advisor.
I mean, and everything else.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But when you look at the other names, Bolton is definitely one of these things is not like the others.
Yeah.
Because it really is. All the promises, all the attacks that Hillary Clinton sustained from Trump, some of the attacks that he sustained, that Trump has waged against other people who've criticized him when it comes to the Iraq War or have criticized him in terms of his other foreign policy comments. He said, well, you voted for the war, you supported the war, you were part of of Bush's Iraq War.
Right.
Well, John Bolton, man, he's like he's one of the starting line on that. So that would just be it would be a very surprising pick.